So, session one today is Forging a Resilient Future for Australia's Youth, and we're privileged to have two outstanding leaders in the country and internationally with us this morning to open us up to some new ideas and thinking. We'll have each of them speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. So for those of you who have joined just this morning, I do want to remind you that when you joined today, there should have been a page which would have a QR code and also an email address, forum2020qa@royalsoc.org.au. Please do send your questions through as the presentations are presented so that we can catch those and have a good discussion at the end. So our first presenter is Genevieve Bell, and Genevieve is going to speak to us about the new normal. I will let you to look at the program for Genevieve's extensive background, but amongst other things, she's Distinguished Professor at the ANU, Director of the 3A Institute and a Senior Fellow at Intel. One of Australia's leading cultural anthropologists, very interested in technology, AI and other things. And Genevieve, we look forward to your reflections this morning. Thank you.
Well, it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to be here, though I suspect I should take issue with being described as a leading anthropologist. I fear I have strayed very far from that discipline. I'm going to attempt to redeem myself by relying on some anthropology today. So what I wanted to do for the next 20 minutes, in the spirit, in some ways, of the invitation of this event, was to reflect a little bit on how we might make sense both of the moment in which we find ourselves and the ways in which we might transit out of it. And I want to bracket those as two quite different things. In some ways, we are still amidst a pandemic, and it has a very particular arc and feel to it. And then I wanted to speculate about on some of the ways we might think about transiting out of it. There are lots of ways to introduce myself. You just heard a brief one. It did touch on some of the important pieces. I am indeed a cultural anthropologist by training. I got my PhD in the United States at Stanford University, where my background in those days was Native American history, feminist and queer theory. You might pause to wonder how someone with that background ended up working in a large American tech company. The short answer is I met a man in a bar. The longer answer is I met a man in a bar and it turned into a job. That has resulted in me spending 20 years working at Intel, where I have helped build user experience competencies, design thinking, and where my last full-time role there was as the company's Chief Foresight Officer, sometimes known as the futurist, or Genevieve just knows things about other things. It was a loose job title. More recently, I have returned back to Australia. I've been home for a little over 3 years now. I'm a Distinguished Professor at the Australian National University, where I also direct a small innovation institute whose slightly more ambitious goal is to establish a new branch of engineering to take AI safely, sustainably, and responsibly to scale. We're doing that by teaching it into existence, by researching into existence, and by theorizing it into existence, and safe in the knowledge that over the last 250 years, people from all over the world have invented new branches of engineering and brought them into existence through sheer force of will, also often accompanied by large-scale technologies that have dominated the landscape and that require human intervention to bring them safely, sustainably, and responsibly to scale. So happily for me, I stand in the footsteps of extraordinary people in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, in the United States, all of whom created new forms of practice to manage machinery. And so it's often from that standpoint that I'm most interested. How do we think about the marrying of historical threads, prior theoretical forms, and how might we use those to imagine and manage technical systems as they exist today? And so it's from that background that I had started reflecting on the moment in which we find ourselves, one that's informed by anthropological theory and also a rich understanding of the technical systems in which we find ourselves located, and thinking about what the way through there is. Because technologies don't just build themselves, they are in fact built by humans, and while they create new protocols and practices, we have an enormous capacity to shape those should we choose to. So there is a moment of pausing here and thinking about what does it mean to make sense of 2020. I'm sure, along with many of you, I was startled to discover it was already November. That feels like an extraordinary act that we are in November already. It doesn't feel like that should have quite happened. I think for many Australians, this has been a year that in some ways started its dislocating form in October or November of last year. This is a year that has seen 70 to 80% of the Australian population impacted by drought, bushfires, smoke, and the consequences of those things. It's seen an entire population impacted by a global pandemic declared on March 11th, Australians sent home on March 23rd. We have variously come out of homes and gone back into homes and closed and opened and closed and reopened all manner of social and commercial enterprises. And I was trying to think about how would you start to talk about that beyond the personal narratives. And it was lovely to hear the previous speaker reflect on the ways we are diarising and collecting the ephemera. But for me, there's also the question of beyond the personal narrative, are there ways of thinking about the pandemic as a structural social moment? And if so, where would we go to think about that? And for me, I wanted to go back to some anthropological theory from the turn of the last century, so actually before the Spanish flu. There is a Belgian anthropologist by the name of Arnold van Gennep, whose followers would then include people like Victor Turner and Mary Douglas. And back over 100 years ago, this particular anthropologist was really interested in thinking about how human beings moved through time and space, and whether there was an archetypal set of structures for how we transited physical spaces and moments in time. And he described those as being rites. What are the rites through which you enact those movements? We have some of them when we came into this building. You put your umbrella down, you scraped your feet off at the doorstep. In my instance, you traded out your Doc Martens for a pair of high heels so that you looked slightly more appropriate for the moment. And we know what all of those things look like. We are enacting a rite of passage, transiting from the, in some ways, profane to the sacred, if you want to think about it that, from the public to the private. Those notions about rites of passage aren't only just about the big things, births, deaths, marriages, and rituals of that scale. They may also half explain the moment we find ourselves in. And for Van Gennep, not only was he interested in those moments of movement, so between things, but he was also about the moments that exist in between the in-betweens. So what he would call the moments of liminal or liminality, shares the same root word as limbo, we mostly know that. But he would talk about the liminal moments between things. So whether it, frankly, for many of my American colleagues who are in a liminal moment now, between having voted and an election being called, they are in a moment that is different than what it was before they voted and what it will be after they voted. And that moment there, as I would say, the moment we find ourselves in the pandemic, according to Van Gennep, has the quality of ambiguity or disorientation that occurs in the middle moment between what was and what will become. And I think, for me, I started to imagine maybe one way to structure the pandemic and to talk about its consequences was to think about it as a liminal moment. And if so, what were the pieces of that liminality? We can articulate them for lots of other ceremonies, but what might they be for this? And my team and I went and had a look at all the kinds of conversations people were having, the formal pieces, the governmental pieces, the individual responses. And we thought there were 6 characteristics of this liminal moment. One of them was that our ideas about time are a little bit up for grabs. I said it was surprising to me it is November. A number of people in the physical room in front of me smiled a knowing smile that went, yes, who knew it was November? Please don't ask me what day it is, and if we get down to the date, the only way I can reference it is because there was an American election and a horse race this week. Otherwise, bets are off. So the notion of time as not having the same contours feels like an obvious characteristic of this particular liminal moment. Whether it's ideas about the contours of time, the flattening out of time, the cadence of it, what once moved fast that now moves slow, what once moved slow that now moves fast. All of those feel like pieces of the puzzle of this moment of liminality. The second piece that I think is a characteristic of this liminal moment has to do with transformations in ideas about presence and embodiment. So what was once physical became virtual. So I'm willing to bet many of you had experiences with a camera and a screen intermediated them that you never thought you would. The idea of sharing drinks across a screen, the idea of drive-by birthday parties and celebrations, the notion of an Anzac Day in this country where people would come to the bottom of their driveways, were extraordinary ways of rethinking the physical, the virtual, the digital, the analog, and of wondering about how things do and don't move. After all, in this particular moment, certain forms of embodiment were also seen as being dangerous. A classic hallmark of liminality. Being present was seen as being dangerous. we were all too close together on a veranda and working out how we should reconfigure our senses of our social selves to maintain distances that feel awkward is part and parcel of what it might mean to have pressure put on ideas about presence and embodiment. The third piece of that architecture for me of this liminal moment is actually about how things are being intermediated. So how are we managing the boundaries? So the thresholds, as it were. Think about this as everything from who manages the seams of the public and the private, who manages the movements of goods and services where they once didn't have to move quite like that, who is policing them, because it's not just about managing them, it is frequently also about policing them, who has had to become a policer of the seams who wouldn't have been otherwise. In this room here, we've now got our wait staff helping us police our own sociality. We have the police arguing about whether hotels are part of their brief. We have an army contemplating where it should sit. Who manages the seams and how they are managed feels like an area that's not only contested but complicated. And a whole lot of people now managing things that weren't seams before. And for me, one of the most startling pieces of that particular part of the liminal moment that is the pandemic is that some of those seams have been invisible for a really long time and are now starkly visible. In many ways, not dissimilar to what happened at Christmas when it was fairly hard to deny certain kinds of vulnerabilities in our systems. This moment of the pandemic has made clear some of our other both vulnerabilities and challenges. I'm willing to bet many of us, even if we regard ourselves as well-educated citizens, didn't always know where everything in our house came from, or how it got there, or how it flowed to the places around us, whether that was something as banal as toilet paper or something as complicated as our voting papers. The notion of what moved and what didn't, and how those things moved, and having to know where they came from, is at least a form of intermediation that is now visible. Whether it becomes invisible again later is complicated. Whether we can forget it again, I'd say doubly so. The fourth thread I think that runs through all of this has to do with ideas about mobility. I think one of the really interesting characteristics of this particular liminal moment is changing ideas about what could move, what should move, what would move, what shouldn't move but did anyway, and where we had fears about things moving. So whether this is about a 25-kilometre iron curtain, whether this is about a postal service worrying about moving things, whether it's about us closing our national boundaries and having to redefine what it means to be an Australian living abroad who can call Australia home but can't come home, or an Australian here who imagines they are part of a global community that they can only see through a digital screen, those are not just questions of privilege, those are questions of positionality that feel as yet unresolved, but very complicated. We also, in some ways, still have an emerging science of a whole other set of mobilities. How does a virus move? Is it airborne? And if so, what is the right distance? How do we imagine closing certain spaces? How do we imagine what it means to have an infected body and where they will move? What does it mean to think about in whose bodies viruses move and how we treat them? Suggests that this particular part of this liminal moment, deeply contested. Fifth one, unsurprisingly, has to do with the nature of relationships. Hardly surprising to many of us here, but during the early days of the pandemic in Australia and the early days of the first lockdown nationwide, there was a lot of borrowed language about we're all in it together. That language started at a community level. That was a grassroots statement from individual households, individual communities wanting to articulate a degree of communal activity that was admirable, and I think in some ways distinctly true in Australia in ways that it's not true in America, where I have spent a great part of my life. I think what was interesting was watching that language move. That language found itself in advertising collateral. It found itself in branded messages. I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room or online here who had emails from organisations who said they were in it with me, and I thought, no, you're not. And why are you telling me that? And why are you still emailing me about that? And the language of relationships became a language that was charged. By the same token, public health rules made it complicated to think about who were your relatives, who were the people you were close to, who could you see and who couldn't you, the notion of who was in your bubble and who wasn't, who was in your household, how many people should be in your household, were all things that became, well, fragmented, disorienting, unfamiliar, as did our notions about what constituted safe connectivity and safe connection. as did notions about what it meant to be a social creature. And those are all complicated things. And then last but by no means least, and I think this is a common theme of all liminal moments, whether they are the big ones or the small ones or the ones we've never had before, notions about who you are and what you are always up for grabs. And I think here everything from the weaponizing of demographics, the weaponizing of millennials are the problem, why are we protecting boomers, the overuse of Karen as a pejorative, were all part and parcel of a way where identity became a thing that was fraught and contested in this space. It's also a place where we know full well, and it would surprise very few of us in this room, that the impact of this moment in time was felt unevenly, and that even unevenness follows a set of well-rehearsed social and cultural inequities. Women bore the brunt of managing homeschooling. Women's careers were more precarious and have suffered as various parts of the economy have closed down. Those are hardly surprises. But what ended up happening around notions of identity, what state were you in? I mean this in a geographic sense, not an emotional one, though that was equally important, all became part and parcel of this period in time. So you have a liminal moment characterized by ideas about time, the body, movement, relationships, intermediation, identity. How do all of those things resolve? Well, if you were to go back to Van Gennep and Turner and Douglas, they would tell you that the arc of these rituals is that first you enter the liminal moment, so you have a rite of separation. We know what that's like. That was the moment where we all ran around and thought, do I have enough things in my house to sustain this moment in time? In some ways, I don't think everyone fully understood as they were doing that moment, the one we exited, we never go back to. When people tell you that we will snap back, it is a delightful phrase that hides an incredible reality that is infinitely more complicated and probably a lot more sad and a lot more charged. So what we exit into, in what Van Gennep would have described the rites of reincorporation, feel like an interesting puzzle. I'd argue we've had little pieces of those rites of reincorporation, whether that was here in New South Wales, the first time you went out and had coffee with someone who didn't live in your household, the first time you went to dinner. For me, the first time I spoke in public, again, on a stage. I think for others of us, for my colleagues in Melbourne, it was being able to see people again that weren't in your household after 110 days. We know what some of those rites look like with the small R, the little ones, about what it means to get on a plane or go to an airport, what it would mean to think about what those rights might look like at a larger scale, at a societal level, at an economic level, at a cultural level, feel as yet unknown. And while we exist in a moment pre-vaccine, or more to the point, pre-working vaccine and pre the distribution of a working vaccine, coupled with a set of relevant treatments, we are destined to stay in a moment that will be a little bit liminal. It may not be a stay-at-home order, but it's still a closed border, it's still a limited mobility, it still has changes about notions of our sociality. So I'm going to argue we're still in that liminal moment, which means we get to contemplate how we might choose to exit it. And for me, the hopeful piece in all of this is that the exiting of it might be a place that we could make some different decisions. One of the reasons for me of attempting to analyse the pandemic this way was to think about, well, if these are all the things we destabilised, are there opportunities as we exit the pandemic to restabilise them in new and different ways? Are there things we want to think about how we are next? Truthfully, when I don't have the anthropological theory hat on, you could just as easily look at the pandemic and say, this has been a series of massive social experiments at scale, the kind no university's ethics committee would ever let you do. And we've had a control group. It's an awful way to talk about Victoria, but they have been. That means we could actually do a critical analysis of things like, what does it mean to do or attempt to do online education? What does it mean to move the population from the office to remote work in the space of less than a month? What does it mean to go from almost no Australians having had a telehealth experience to more than 70% of them having had one? What does it mean to have changed our statistics on online shopping from data that had us as a trailing market to a leading one? What does it mean to effectively have stopped using cash almost entirely to the point that I defy you to find any in your handbag or pocket? What would it mean to think about those things as experiments and to analyse the consequences of them, and to realise that there are some pieces we could do at a structural, societal, regulatory level that would make bringing some of those things forward easier? Whether that's changing the payment system so that telehealth consultations can continue, because truthfully, they are advantageous for all kinds of groups of people, where being able to see your doctor at the appointed time without having to think about parking or worrying about where you're going to put your kids or how you're going to get into the office seems like a good thing. But we also know that making online education successful is more than just putting your PowerPoint slides online. We know that remote work is more than just giving someone a webcam and a laptop. It actually means changing the nature of how your organisation functions, the purpose of meetings, your, I suspect, ways of engaging and thinking. But all of those things would require conscious and deliberate effort. And so for me, making an argument here that says, while we are in the pandemic, we have many things we need to contend with. As we exit the pandemic, we have opportunities to think critically and carefully about what our rights, with the big R and the small r, of reincorporation should be. And I wanted to leave you with Van Gennep, who imagined that these rites of passage were a necessary part of any society, and that indeed there would be many of them in the arc of a society, and that notion of separating and reuniting and changing form and condition and dying and being reborn and to act and to cease and to wait and to rest and to begin again but in a different way was the nature of what it meant to be human. So with that, I want to stop and say thank you.